Pulitzer Prizes for his previous books. He's joined in this discussion by Steven Pinker, a psychologist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the author of a book called How the Mind Works.
Good evening. Welcome to Barnes & Noble Union Square. I would like to thank you all for joining us on this special occasion for a dialogue between two of the foremost scientists of our time, Professor E.O. Wilson and Steven Pinker. Professor Wilson is currently Pellegrino University Professor Emeritus and Curator in Entomology of the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. He has twice won the Pulitzer Prize in General Nonfiction for On Human Nature and the Ants. His new book is Consilience, The Uniting of Culture. Steven Pinker, one of the world's leading cognitive scientists, is professor of psychology and the director of the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is the author of How the Mind Works. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming Professor E.O. Wilson and Steven Pinker.
Thank you very much. I've been asked to lead off tonight, and I do so with pleasure while expressing added pleasure that I can appear here tonight with my colleague, Steve Pinker, who's we're just getting to know each other. We hadn't worked together or spoken together before. My job is to present essentially the elements of the argument of consilience. And I will mention in passing in the 10 minutes or so that I attempt this to make reference to Pinker's own area of research, cognitive neuroscience. The word consilience is, I didn't just get it out of the air. It's been around for 160 years. It was introduced in 1840 by William Whewell, who is generally regarded as the founder of the philosophy of science, and he meant it to be, in a very strictly defined sense, the interlocking of cause and effect explanation across different disciplines, the strength of which, he said, would determine the validity of the theoretical explanations in those respective disciplines. The word has been used sparingly by philosophers of science ever since, and I mean to drag it out into the mainstream where it will be very likely corrupted by multiple usage and co-opted and so on if this effort is successful. It means essentially the same thing as coherence or interconnectedness or the convergence theory of truth, but whereas particularly those first two words have acquired many meanings through heavy use, this is not the case for consilience. Consilience, then, is the mother's milk of the natural sciences. And I think you can get a sense of what is going on when I say that in the 19th century, physics and chemistry became consilient. That is to say, chemistry was demonstrated thoroughly to be obedient to the laws of physics. And in the 20th century, the great triumph of molecular biology extended that web work of cause and effect explanation on up into the macromolecules that determine information and catalyze the organic reactions that drive life. And now what's important is that through the relentless expansion of the natural sciences, doubling in numbers of published discoveries and workers and journals every 15 years or so, at least up to about the 1970s, has moved inexorably into the borderland areas, as I like to call them, between the natural sciences and the social sciences plus the humanities. Now, the natural sciences are pretty fully consilient all the way from quantum physics through reagent chemistry to macromolecular biology, to cell biology, organismic biology, and on up to, as we will address tonight jointly, the brain itself, the working of the brain, and mind. With the prospect, and this is what makes Consilience still speculative, yet promising and exciting to an increasing number of scholars on both sides of that line, the prospects of Consilience extending on at last to the social sciences and the humanities. That, of course, was the dream, one of the dreams of the Enlightenment thinkers of the 17th and the 18th centuries, that all of human knowledge could be unified and that this unification would serve to the progress of the human species. It failed to deliver on its promise from the natural sciences, however, and that was just one of the reasons why the original Enlightenment died toward the end of the 18th century. Now the renewal, and this would be my main argument, a part of my main historical part of my argument, the time has arrived at last to consider the renewal of the Enlightenment and a unification agenda. The central part of the argument then devolves to that line which for centuries has been drawn between the two cultures, roughly defined as the two cultures. The natural sciences on one side, the social sciences, particularly the humanistic aspects of the social sciences, and the humanities on the other side. We are now, I think, discovering by efforts coming from both sides of that line that it is not an epistemological discontinuity with different truths and ways of thinking fundamentally different on both sides. It is not that line, a Hadrian wall, built to keep the reductionist barbarians from the sciences away from high culture. But it is, in fact, as it disappears, being revealed to consist of a domain, a very broad domain of little understood and mostly unexplored phenomena. And that brings me then to the borderland disciplines arising from the natural sciences, which is Steve Pinker and my common interest. These borderland disciplines, which are beginning to bridge over, particularly to the social sciences at long last, are four in number. I believe they can be counted that way. First of all, cognitive neuroscience, also known as the brain sciences, which is imaging with rapidly improving resolution in time and space, the activities of the brain. And these activities are more and more complex, so the searching ability of these techniques is improving swiftly. A second borderland discipline is behavioral genetics, human behavioral genetics, which through combinations of very sophisticated analysis of the genetic relationships correlated with cognitive and other characteristics of mental activity in human beings, and the rapid advance of human genetics overall to the molecular level, to the level of the gene and the genetic code, is beginning to provide a solid foundation on which to build a biological understanding of the programming of the anatomy of the brain and ultimately of its algorithms and thus biological activities. A third borderland discipline is evolutionary biology, the attempts to trace the history of the human species, and now especially the origins of the mind in terms of the survival and reproductive value it gives, the Darwinian fitness. This was a subject that I got into 20 years ago with sociobiology in the early stages of this investigation. Sociobiology is now also known as evolutionary psychology and has lost a lot of its sting. It's now seen much more as a reasonable discipline in its own right, well cultivated now by a new generation of very bright scholars. And finally, environmental sciences are as the borderland discipline that describes with increasing definitive detail the arena in which the human species as a biological species evolved and to which we are exquisitely well adapted. So environmentalism is a way of thinking, and as well as a discipline that benefits from the naturalistic approach, the materialist approach, foretold by the extension of the natural sciences into that borderland area. And not to neglect the contributions of the social sciences, similar historia, the development, extensions are occurring from the social sciences through fields like cognitive psychology and biological anthropology, and they are beginning to meet and interconnect consiliently with the natural sciences. The key to understanding what is happening and why it is important is, in my judgment, that this approach is allowing us at long last to provide a precise and operational definition of human nature, and I will offer it now. Human nature is not the genes that prescribe human nature. Human nature is not the cultural universals like the incest taboo and the rites of passage found all through the human species, which are the products of human nature. Human nature is the epigenetic rules, the hereditary regularities in development, and particularly mental development, that lead to the consistencies of large sectors of human behavior and biases in the evolution, the cultural evolution that has become well defined, I think, within ethnography and many psychological studies. So once we have defined that and we've able to make the linkages across the borderland areas from genes to organismic biology, to the brain, to the working of the brain, the algorithms, the regularities in mental development that characterize the human species, and then approach that broad, unknown, largely still unexplored area between the development of the individual human mind and then in aggregate of culture itself, leading to cultural evolution. Then we will have begun to make a completely consilient connection. This I regard, the latter I regard as the key problem of the social sciences, the interaction of genetic evolution with cultural evolution. That's nature and nurture at that level, just as I think any biologist outside of perhaps the narrowest purviews of molecular biology would agree that the master problem of the natural sciences is now the solution of the brain, what it is of action and what is the mind and what is human consciousness. So I'm going to stop at this point, but I'm by saying that it would be very useful for me, as I have done in the book Consilience, to, but I don't have time to spell it out, maybe this will emerge in our conversation, to describe some of these epigenetic rules and show why they are so important. Among them certainly are the algorithms of language, the language instinct, to use Steve Pinker's expression, on which we have gained so much more knowledge. Others have to do with virtually, well, the major categories of human behavior are beginning to be illuminated, I think, by the definition of epigenetic rules, and therefore the relation between genes and development of the mind. This is where the action is. I also like to suggest that not only is this where much of the action of scholarship will be in the future, both social sciences, humanistic scholarship with the natural sciences, but also this is where, by shifting the frame of discourse to the intermediate areas and to the entire question of consilience, does it exist? Does it not? Is it universal? What will it look like? That we can bring about a revitalization of the liberal arts. If you want to have a discourse between the natural scientists and the social sciences and the scholars and the humanities and the teachers of these subjects, at least in higher education, this is where to have it. Whether you are promoting the Consilience program and are actively exploring it as a scholar or a scientist, or whether you reject it philosophically or viscerally, this is what we, in discussing the issues thoroughly, can hope to revitalize the liberal arts, which are in terrible condition in our colleges and universities, incidentally. So with that, I'm going to invite Steve to just lead off and make a speech, or ask a question, refute, destroy, humiliate, anything he wants to do. But maybe we'd better stay seated for this, rather than just hopping back and forth on the table. Steve.
Well, I think we're all seeing a nice example of consilience here tonight by the fact that Professor Ed Wilson and I are sharing ideas on these topics. In Ed Wilson's, I'm sorry? Okay.
Maybe shove a little forward.
I think you're seeing a nice example of consilience tonight in the fact that Professor Ed Wilson and I are having this dialogue. In his day job, Professor Wilson studies ants, which is a subject that only a scientist could love. And I study language, which is the quintessential cultural trait. It's the way in which we transmit a great deal of our cultural information, and it's often held up as mankind's proudest cultural achievement. On the other hand, I think that they're really closely connected. I think it's just a matter of convenience that we're in different kinds of departments, but that there really are two different aspects of the same subject matter. I happen to study one particular organ of one particular species. For me, the species isn't ants, it's Homo sapiens. And rather than studying chemical communication, I study the kind of communication that we do by modifying the noise that we make when we exhale. But I do think that the two approaches are really just different ends of one large fabric of knowledge. And that idea is what Ed Wilson calls consilience. It's an idea with which I'm deeply sympathetic. So let me start off with a question. This sounds so wonderful and so, to me, obvious that all of knowledge is connected, that there's a set of laws that works at different levels of analysis, that ultimately even the products of culture are the products of human nature, which in turn are products of a brain, which is a biological organ, which evolved with the rest of the animal kingdom. But why did you need to write a book? Why do people seem to hate this idea so much? I'm not denying that they do. I'm not denying that you needed to write the book. But what is the opposing point of view that would say that there are discontinuities in knowledge?
Certainly there is opposition to the basic idea, not in the way of modeling cause and effect explanations. I think that if you accept a naturalistic or materialistic view of how the whole world works, then including even an empiricist view of the origin of moral reasoning and religious feeling, and I've included that, then it's very difficult to think of a specific model of cause and effect or relationship among the bodies of knowledge that are covered by the great branches of learning. On the opposition to the basic approach is twofold. One is methodological, namely the belief that the brain is just too complex an organ. The mind is too evanescent, too flickering, too intangible, inaccessible a phenomenon, even if you accept that it's material, to ever put a handle on and treat in the manner of the natural sciences. To the answer to this, all I can say is, once again, referring to the progress of the natural sciences to where we are this evening, that exactly that same argument was offered at the turn of the century about vitalism, the nature of life. Life, it was said, would never be explained at the molecular level, just too complicated and so on. And then, of course, when we came to the subject of heredity, it was said, oh, well, the genetic code has got to be a protein. I remember that in around the early 50s, before DNA structure was elucidated. The genetic code it's got to be so complex that we will never break it, or it will take a century or two before we begin to break it. And so none of that has proved to be the case. Therefore, I believe optimism in pressing forward into this unknown domain that we are speaking of here between the biological sciences and the cognition and thence the social sciences, optimism is justified. Now, the other reason is opposition, I think, is philosophical and visceral. It is that there must be something about the human condition that is forever removed from such inquiry. But I've felt that that is not a very easily defended position. That is certainly not a reason for discouraging the exploration that goes forward. A part of this, and I don't want to be too long-winded. You have permission when I finish to be long-winded yourself. These are subjects that one can go on at great length about. Is the fear of reductionism. Reductionism. What are these natural scientists up to? Good Lord, if we keep funding them through the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, they're going to reduce everything to molecules and processes, at least in the way we account for them. Maybe we'd better stop the whole thing right here. Well, this is a gross misunderstanding, a result of gross misunderstanding of reductionism. Scientists are not conquistadors out to melt the Inca gold. Reductionism is part of the scientific process that has proved so successful. All of creative scientists start with a complex process in mind, a cell, an organism, a brain. And they progress. This has been the triumph of the Western methodology. They progress by finding ways to cleave that system into elements and then fundamental processes. But that's just the first step. The ultimate triumph of the scientific method is the resynthesis of those elements and processes, either with mathematical models initially or literal resynthesis, such that we first reduce the complex process, having understood it as well as we could, reduce it, and now resynthesize it, understanding it vastly better than we did at the beginning. Reduction goes far more quickly than does synthesis, and that has been the story of the science. Predictive synthesis is extremely difficult, but it has progressed through physics, chemistry, and all the way up, in the way I see it, to the three-dimensional structure of the protein molecule. And that's about where they're stalled right now as they try to work their way around. They need higher, the biochemists need higher computational capacity, and they need more precise measurements of molecular interaction within the molecule. So you get the impression when you read about how science is working these days that it's all reduction, but it is not. It's both processes.
Yes. I'm deeply sympathetic to that way of looking at it. And in fact, in my own thinking, the two other aspects of living things that were thought to be intractable by the methods of the natural sciences, I think have submitted to that analysis in the last couple of decades. One of them being the world of meaning and ideas and reasons and goals, which obviously play a crucial role in explaining human behavior. And it was often said that humans are fundamentally different from anything else in the natural world because physical events have causes. One billiard ball clacks into another, whereas human behavior is determined by reasons. That when John got on the bus, it wasn't because a puff of air blew him onto the bus or a magnet pulled him on, but because he wanted to get onto the bus, because he knew that the bus would take him to his grandmother and he wanted to visit his grandmother, and that could never be explained in materialist terms. Well, for the last 30 or 40 years, I think we've seen that notions such as beliefs and desires can be understood in physical terms using the concepts from computation and information processing and cybernetics. We have artificially intelligent systems that in a very real sense have knowledge and beliefs and goals, and that's a fruitful way of understanding the function of the brain, how it is that this particular organ in our skull unlike the other organs, can give rise to the phenomena of meaning and reasons and ideas that are so essential in explaining behavior. The other idea, I think, is evolution, in particular the mechanism of natural selection, which accounts for another seeming puzzle in the natural world, the existence of design. The fact that organs of the body, including the brain, like man-made contrivances such as watches and ships and wagons, seem to have so many parts arranged so uncannily to do something interesting that you can't conceive of it coming into existence without a designer, namely God. And I think Darwin's lasting contribution is to show how signs of good engineering in the natural world, eyes that have lenses and irises that open and close in response to the light, joints that are lubricated and that swing freely, and so on, can be explained in perfectly material terms by the process of natural selection. So for me, those are the idea of computation and evolution are the bridges that are going to tie human nature and ultimately culture to the rest of biology. I think sewing up this seamless fabric that we're all seeking. But let me turn it into a question. Do you think that there's still a great deal of dualistic belief, even among people who would not consider themselves religious in any dogmatic sense? To give an example, a couple of years ago, Francis Crick wrote a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis. The astonishing hypothesis being that the mind is the activity of the brain. And he got some grief from brain scientists about this. You call that astonishing? Well, that's just obviously true. We assume that before we walk into the door of the lab, but at least what I've learned is, reading some of the reviews of my own book, is that it still is an astonishing hypothesis, that the ghost in the machine hovering over our brains, so pulling the levers and reading the little gauges, is still an active idea even among people who aren't religious, and is tied into the whole idea that of where morality and human dignity come from. We don't consider it a sin to dismantle a machine. We do consider it a sin to harm a human being. Therefore, human beings cannot be machines, and therefore the reductionist scheme must fail. We don't hold objects responsible when they are caused to do things. We do hold humans responsible when they act. Therefore, human actions can't be caused in the ordinary physical sense. To preserve the idea of responsibility and morality, therefore, we need this notion of some part of a human that is not just physiological activity of the brain, or meat puppets, as one reviewer of my book put it. How do you respond to that kind of criticism?
Descartes has died hard, so that life is hard for a cognitive neuroscientist like yourself, and who has colleagues who will declare that you're just stating the obvious to them, and the others just state, many others state that what you're suggesting is so ridiculous that it's not worth even responding to. I believe that one of the most promising developments in cognitive neuroscience has been a suite of models, explicit neurobiological models, maybe not down to the fine details of the circuitry, but nonetheless descriptions of what the conscious mind might be, what subjective consciousness may be, in terms of the mapping process, that is, the mind itself as a map of the external world processed at an almost unbelievably dense and sophisticated manner by that neat computer, but at such a level that it is still extremely difficult for us to get at it even reductionistically. Nonetheless, we have now received enough insights from computational models in AI and from neurobiological models that are based on real discoveries of circuitry of the brain, of the relation of the endocrine system, hormone mediation of responses, neurotransmitter mediation of mood and so on, and a clear definition, as you say, of intention, so that it is possible to put together a reasonable account of what the mind really is and where the self fits in it. The self has to be the central figure of these scenarios that the mind consists of. Our scenarios passing back through time into the future and the present, multiplying possible scenarios so that we arrive at a decision that matches intention based upon those epigenetic rules and the cultural and background and personal experience, can be welded together into a reasonable naturalistic account of what the mind is, with the self being a necessary central actor in this sequence of scenarios. In fact, our intense desire, I would suggest, to put everything in narratives, right down to the preference of everybody in this room, including myself, when they buy a book, to have a book that has a story in it. The mind is a narration producer, is a reflection of the fundamental scenario building activity of the mind. I don't know exactly how you feel about that, but does that sound like a reasonable, if somewhat embryonic description of what's happening in the world of cognitive neuroscience, integrative neuroscience?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I'm going to turn now to something that I find more of a puzzle for both of us, where I get the feeling that you're more confident that we have or will soon have an answer than I am. And this is what we might call the irrational thought, including many religious beliefs that we see in all human cultures. Just an example, you have a wonderful description of what used to be called primitive thought, but might more accurately be called the thought patterns that characterize probably humans in all societies, but most markedly pre-scientific societies. Describe it as intuitive and dogmatic, bound up with specific emotional relationships rather than physical causality, preoccupied with essences and metamorphosis, opaque to logical abstraction or arrays of the hypothetically possible, prone to use language for social interaction rather than as a conceptual tool, limited in quantification mostly to rough images of frequency and rarity, and inclined to view mind as stemming partly from the environment and able to project back out into it so that words become entities with power unto themselves. And that isn't the half of it. I mean, people in all societies have what can only be described as daffy beliefs, such as you can bribe the gods for good weather. You can divine the future from tea leaves and chicken entrails and so on. You can, if your child gets sick, it's because a spell was cast on them by someone in another tribe, and you should go out and risk your life attacking the tribe in revenge for the spell that they've cast that makes your child sick. Now, these are nutty beliefs. They seem to be widespread. I think it's insulting to say in primitive societies, because you can certainly see evidence for them in our own. As both of us are apt to believe, the human brain is an organ that evolved to solve the kinds of problems that our ancestors faced in a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, since it no doubt is maladaptive to waste even a moment or a morsel of food bribing gods for good weather. Why is this such a characteristic trait of our species? Why should we be ashamed for our species?
Yeah, a reader of the book in manuscript commented to me that, you know, you're not just describing the primitive mind, you're describing the average American. And I think one area where our thinking has converged, it's a nice example of consilience at work out at this outer edge of the natural sciences where we both are working, is the conception that the brain evolved for survival. It did not evolve for self-understanding. That's why people know less about their brains than they do about their automobiles. And the role of science, and let me stress too that science is not a arcane activity by an elite group of people. Science is the common body of accumulated and testable information possessed by all. The function of science has very much been, and throughout most human activities, is increasingly effective in taking these prisms and filters of the mind and the algorithms we have that do give us adaptive value, give these strange ways of thinking adaptive value, and showing what the true correspondence is by multiple methods with our sensory input and our ways of logic, the correspondence to the real world. And so this, I think, is very much a part of the Natural Sciences Consilience project. I wonder how we're doing on time. I was just thinking that we were thinking in terms of about a half an hour, and I don't want to cut you off on this, but it might be a good idea to, maybe I'm preempting our moderator here, but of simply opening it up to discussion. Expatiation, rebuttal, humiliation. So why not? Go ahead.
Well, it seems that, as I thought on the way down, the two of you are really very strongly in agreement on just about everything. I don't see any disagreement sign of it between you. There are people who disagree. There are dualists out there, as you know, and I think among them probably is Thomas Nagel. Nagel, as you both know, said at one point, it's consciousness that makes the mind-body problem so intractable, which is why all studies of it either ignore it or get it hopelessly wrong. Now, I don't think you've got it hopelessly wrong, but it seems to me that in the book, How the Mind Works, it is kind of ignored. It is kind of shunted aside. Daniel Dennett has a book called Consciousness Explained, which does not explain it. Would either or both of you in the next 2 minutes or so be able to explain it to us?
Let me turn that over to Steve, but let me just, right, I knew I was going to be able to dump something on him, but no, I actually, this is a challenging problem, and it is a very worthwhile to, I mean, it's a privilege to try to answer it. Let me say, first of all, though, about that problem, that philosophers like Nagel, with all due respect, were writing, for the most part, before cognitive neuroscience. And now we have a very different picture. I think it's significant that philosophy appears to be dwindling, particularly philosophy of mind, with the best minds, and there are superb minds indeed out there, like Dennett and the Churchlands. They seem to be abandoning philosophy, although they won't admit it, in order to become theoretical scientists. Some of the best philosophers now are really theoretical neuroscientists or theoretical ecologists. And therefore, I think we see signs already that the search is on, and that hope exists even among philosophers, that problem, which was considered intractable, can be solved. The mass of literature that has been coming out when put together, as I attempted to put it together, like that from the Churchlands, from Steve Coughlin, from Daniel Dennett, from Damasio and others. As an outsider, I could sort of review it and try to put it together in what I considered a consensus. And that's what I've done in Consilience. And I have no great difficulty myself in imagining how that problem of consciousness can be solved. But I went on too long. What do you say, Steve?
I do discuss consciousness actually in some length in How the Mind Works, and I divide between what one philosopher called the hard problem of consciousness and the easy problem of consciousness. Easy is ironic in that it'll be a good century or more before we figure it out. But the easy problem is, how does the information processing activity of the brain give rise to conscious experience? How does anesthesia work? What parts of the brain light up when we see red or taste salt or feel pain or have an idea or fall in love? What counterparts can we find for these activities in other animals, and therefore how might we reconstruct the evolution and so on. And that is an active area of psychology and neuroscience, and I think progress is going to increase until we have a complete understanding. The hard problem is why we're conscious at all. And this is Nagel's problem. What is it like to be a bat? Don't tell me what the bat responds to or how the circuitry works, but what would it be like if I were in the bat's shoes or claws or whatever a bat has? How do I know that your red is the same as my red? When Captain Kirk steps into the transporter room and he's reassembled on the planet, is it the same Kirk, or did one Kirk commit suicide and another come into being? These are what are traditionally called philosophical problems. They keep you up in the dorm room when you're in college till the wee hours. You go around and around, and they're great fun, and you never seem to get any closer to a solution. The idea that I put forward, based on a suggestion from the philosopher Colin McGinn, is that there are some truths of science that the human mind may never grasp at an intuitive level. So just as I will never really understand what came before the Big Bang, even though I'm assured that the question is meaningless and that time didn't exist before the Big Bang, or how something can be a wave and a particle at the same time, that's nonetheless part of my mind can accept that as truth, while another part can never really feel it in my bones. And similarly, the idea that the information processing activity of the brain gives rise to subjective experience, to my own sentience, is an idea that the scientific part of me knows is true, because I know that if the brain no longer functions, consciousness vanishes, and if you change its electrophysiological functioning by taking drugs, you have, as they say, altered consciousness, and so on and so on. Nonetheless, why that should be true, I suspect, is something that we're never going to be able to intuitively feel, even as we understand it at a mechanical level in more and more detail.
Steve, just to show that we didn't spend a month in advance making sure that we're in 100% agreement, let me suggest that you're wavering. And that independently of you, I worried about this, the hard problem, as Neil Chalmers and others have suggested it. And it didn't seem to me to create much of a difficulty, because I've spent a lot of my time thinking about how animals may be thinking. And I think that the answer is to this is that we will not know what they feel like, what their subjective impressions are, but that does not matter. When you could have a person who's colorblind, I remember that was the one originated by the philosopher Jackson and carried on by Neil Chalmers. A person who's colorblind really can never understand what red is when we think of it. Well, so be it. If you had an ant that was raised to high intelligence, seeing the world of an ant as an ant sees it, we could map all the neurons of that ant brain, and we would know what it was seeing and what impressions it was having, but we would not have a subjective impression. We could never have that. Do we need to have that knowledge in order to say that we fully understand the process? I think not. When people do have the same sensory capacities most humans do, and they have a similar background and vocabulary and the like, then it would be quite possible for you and me to communicate by watching, I mean theoretically in the future, communicate with one another literally by watching one another's brain scans on a screen. That would be the answer. It may not be adequate, but let me say I'm a little more reckless than you are.
I do agree with the major assertion, namely that scientifically it makes no difference if we ever, whether or not we ever solve this problem, and I suspect that we won't, that if we could trace the flow of information through a nervous system and predict how the patterns would result in behavior, then the job of the scientist would pretty much be done. And whether it's an ant or a human, then we would be satisfied. The only difference is that there are a couple of non-scientific ways of thinking that would still be deeply unsatisfied. One of them being just plain old-fashioned human curiosity. Well, what is it like to be a bat? Or what is your red like? If I could see the world from your eyes, what would it look like? Or if someone offered me the opportunity to step into the transporter room, should I do it or not? Even if no one could tell the difference from the outside, I could tell the difference from the inside. And I suspect that we're never going to answer these questions, but I suspect that we will always be curious about them. But even more significantly, I think a lot of moral intuitions hinge on our imperfect attempts to grapple with this problem. The starkest example being, if you had a robot that was wired up to behave exactly like a human, but you knew it was just a bunch of clanking gears and chips and levers and so on, would dismantling it be destruction of property or murder? This was actually played out in an old episode of Star Trek and many other science fiction stories where, should you be allowed to dismantle Lieutenant Commander Data to reverse engineer him, or would this be snuffing out a sentient being? And the answer to the question really hinges on this unanswerable question of whether there really is someone home inside Lieutenant Commander Data who actually feels something that you would be extinguishing as you dismantled it. And so I think we are left in something of a dilemma, that our moral reasoning depends at least in part on issues that, as scientists, we are at some point have to punt on.
You left some work for the philosophers.
Yeah, exactly.
Would you comment on my opinion of what the concept of mind is? I feel that it's an energy, soul consciousness of the energy going through matter, solid matter, like nerves and neurons and the gray matter, that in the essence, that upon death, it will even penetrate the brain itself and go on to further dimensions or ways of thinking that consciousness, its essential nature is. Could you
I think I speak for both of us in saying, I think I disagree. I think that both of us would say that the mind really comes from the neurophysiological activity of the brain. And when the brain dies, the mind is over and done with. One kind of evidence is that despite heroic attempts at the 19th century, no one...
electrical light signals throughout our brain picking up words that you had pre-recorded, and that your consciousness is apart from your physical body. It is a light force, and you could define what light and electricity is, how it could penetrate the matter and metals and so forth. Then you define what consciousness is. And if you avoid pointing out that discrepancy, it is a truth unto itself that you can't not just, avoid and say and poo-poo it doesn't exist. It does exist. That's our essence.
It does exist, but no one has been able to communicate with the dead despite heroic efforts. And there's no aspect of mental activity that has not been tied to the functioning of the brain. There's nothing that you can do to the brain that doesn't change consciousness and thought and emotion. So reasonable hypothesis is that the mind is the activity of the brain described at a higher level of analysis, and that without the brain, the mind doesn't exist. That sounds like a grim conclusion, but I think it's an exhilarating conclusion.
Like saying consciousness doesn't exist, and your conscious words to me, I could say doesn't exist because it's not making sense.
Good. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you for all your work. I just want to recommend a book which you might be familiar with. It's called Without Miracles by Gary Cziko, C-Z-I-K-O, and it really kind of uses variation and selection as the process, as the consilience, really. That's the thing. I also want to suggest that the reason religious thought persists is that it's almost like a lot of religious language is very uncertain. There's a lot of uncertainty about, like, in the beginning was the word, or Zen koan, and I think it's a kind of play activity for the brain. That's sometimes I think that's why people enjoy it. Anyway,
well, when you speak of the religious experience, you're actually speaking of an entire, a broad ensemble of intense intellectual and emotional experiences, and certainly these include the desire for mystery, of the unknown. We just seem to have a deep love of the unknown, that we still can move toward and make great discoveries and bring ourselves to higher levels of fulfillment. I think that probably is Paleolithic. It goes along with the evolution in the capacity of the mind and our emotions that help make humanity so successful as it spread around the world. But another aspect that certainly is extremely powerful is the need for communion, for a feeling that you belong to something greater than yourself. This can be the tribe, it can be a great ideology that's sweeping across humanity. It can be a family, but most powerfully, it latches onto or creates, as part of cultural evolution, the traditional religions with their cosmologies, their rites of passage, their liturgy, and this gives deep emotional satisfaction, because to belong to a group, to be able to participate fully in it and be altruistic to other members and even be willing to some degree of self-sacrifice has enormous Darwinian value, as pointed out actually first by Darwin in The Descent of Man. The ultimate then being what we seek, combining elements of mystery and communion in what is called the mystical union of many religions, considered the ultimate is the mystical union with whatever it is, the divinity, the sense of wholeness, and so on. That I think we will never give up. Indeed, you are witnessing it in my expressions of optimism about Consilience.
Hi. My question is addressed to both of you, whoever wants to take a shot at it. So,
yeah. Can you speak up a little bit? I'm a bit hard of
Yeah.
hearing. I'm sorry. Otherwise, you're going to get this guy answering all the questions.
Okay. Okay, so our brain seems to have a fairly evolved ability to appreciate and enjoy music. And the music that we enjoy, at least apparently, doesn't seem to be correlated with stimulus that we get from the outside world, but rather is of our own creation. So, we don't hear Beethoven in nature, or anything even remotely like it. How, in some sense, what survival value does our fairly sophisticated and evolved ability to appreciate music have?
I know that Steve, well, I'm not just trying to shove this onto you, because one of my own graduate students did his PhD on neurobiology of music using lesions for a musica patients to figure out what some of the controls of music synthesis circuitry could be. But I know you've written on this substantially, so I'd like you to answer that.
Okay. It's an excellent question, and it's a real puzzle. I think part of the answer is that there's no reason to think that everything that people do or enjoy has survival value. That given a brain that has a number of mechanisms that do have survival value, there can often be new combinations that in themselves don't. So when you have a species that's equipped with the circuits that give it a sense of pleasure in certain environments, in pleasant landscapes, with tastes of nutritious foods, with auditory patterns that can be analyzed, you have a species that also can manipulate the environment, use cause and effect to build things, to bring about consequences. You put those together and you've got a species that can figure out ingenious ways of stimulating its own pleasure circuitry, of basically getting at our pleasure buttons and pressing them, even if that short-circuiting doesn't itself have survival value. A simple example is junk food, rich desserts, which certainly don't have survival value, but given a creature that evolved a taste for sweet and fatty and salty food, given a creature that over the past few centuries has invented food technology, we simply concoct artificial stimuli for the sole purpose of giving ourselves pleasure, exploiting circuits that did have survival value, but not necessarily fostering our own survival now. Now, in the case of music, as you point out, it is a human creation, but it does tap circuits in the brain that must have existed for other purposes. One of the purposes is simply analyzing complex sounds into their waveforms, and there's good reason to believe that the ear and the brain do a kind of harmonic analysis and look for frequency components that are in harmonic relationships, which is the alphabet of tonal music. We also respond to the emotional contours in one another's speech, the tone of voice that expresses anger and sympathy and sarcasm and so on. We respond to vocalizations that aren't part of language but that express emotion, like crying, whimpering, sighing, moaning, and so on. And so a hunch is that music consists of the ability to develop technologies, basically noisemakers in the world, that excite the same circuits in the brain that originally evolved to analyze complex sounds and to respond to the emotional coloring of one another's speech and voices. Now that isn't, I'm not completely satisfied with that as an answer because it doesn't explain the nitty-gritty details of tonal music, but I think it's an entry into the problem.
Let me pose just another question to you related to that. Extremely important, obviously. My impression of the neurobiological work so far, as sparse as it is on the musical capacity, is that the linguistic and the musical circuitry is overlapping. They hold certain circuits in common, but there are some that are unique to musical capacity. And the proposal has been made that music, even as we see it developed in present societies, preceded language and in fact may have facilitated the origin of spoken language, of linguistics. What is your view on that?
My hunch is that it's the other way around, that it is clear that music borrows some of its circuitry from language, both at the neurophysiological level and in terms of the actual content. The fact that musical pieces are organized into phrases, that they have a rhythm that can be aligned with the rhythm of speech, so that we put lyrics to music and the stresses in the words correspond to the beats in the music. The fact that music has the feeling that it conveys a message, and that there are rise and fall patterns in the pitch that evoke emotion in the same way that particular forms of oratory and poetry can in speech. But if one wants to think that the useful thing came first and the byproduct was a consequence of that, then it's easy to see what the use of language was. We exchange information. Whereas for the puzzle of music is how useless and frivolous it is from the biological point of view of survival and fitness. As meaningful as, of course, it is in our everyday lives, it's, I think, a puzzle to a biologist, and that leads me to suspect that it's a byproduct of other things that were useful. Language being one, auditory analysis being another, and motor control being a third. The fact that when we run or walk or do repetitive tasks, there's an optimal rhythm, and so the system of movement needs an innate sense of rhythm. Music somehow taps into that, although how it does, we don't really understand.
It seems to have a universal value too in binding groups together. That is, as part of the rituals. But
in a minute, Barbara Goldsmith discusses her biography of Victoria Woodhull, a 19th century suffragist, spiritualist, and presidential candidate.
If you'd like a videotape copy of this or any C-SPAN program, check our website. The address is www.cspan.org.
Is generally regarded as the founder of the philosophy of science, and he meant it to be, in a very strictly defined sense, the interlocking of cause and effect explanation across different disciplines, the strength of which, he said, would determine the validity of the theoretical explanations in those respective disciplines. The word has been used sparingly by philosophers of science ever since, and I mean to drag it out into the mainstream, where it will be very likely corrupted by multiple usage and co-opted and so on if this effort is successful. It means essentially the same thing as coherence or interconnectedness or the convergence theory of truth, but whereas particularly those first two words have acquired many meanings through heavy use, this is not the case for consilience. Consilience, then, is the mother's milk of the natural sciences. And I think you can get a sense of what is going on when I say that in the 19th century, physics and chemistry became consilient. That is to say, chemistry was demonstrated thoroughly to be obedient to the laws of physics. And in the 20th century, the great triumph of molecular biology extended that web work of cause and effect explanation on up into the macromolecules that determine information and catalyze the organic reactions that drive life. And now what's important is that through the relentless expansion of the natural sciences, doubling in numbers of published discoveries and workers and journals every 15 years or so, at least up to about the 1970s, has moved inexorably into the borderland areas, as I like to call them, between
Pulitzer Prizes for his previous books. He's joined in this discussion by Steven Pinker, a psychologist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the author of a book called How the Mind Works.
Good evening. Welcome to Barnes & Noble Union Square. I would like to thank you all for joining us on this special occasion for a dialogue between two of the foremost scientists of our time, Professor E.O. Wilson and Steven Pinker. Professor Wilson is currently Pellegrino University Professor Emeritus and Curator in Entomology of the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. He has twice won the Pulitzer Prize in General Nonfiction for On Human Nature and the Ants. His new book is Consilience, The Uniting of Culture. Steven Pinker, one of the world's leading cognitive scientists, is Professor of Psychology and the Director of the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is the author of How the Mind Works. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming Professor E.O. Wilson and Steven Pinker.
Thank you very much. I've been asked to lead off tonight, and I do so with pleasure while expressing added pleasure that I can appear here tonight with my colleague, Steve Pinker, who's, we've just getting to know each other. We hadn't worked together or spoken together before. My job is to present essentially the elements of the argument of consilience. And I will mention in passing in the 10 minutes or so that I attempt this to make reference to Pinker's own area of research, cognitive neuroscience. The word consilience is, I didn't just get it out of the air. It's been around for 160 years. It was introduced in 1840 by William Whewell, who reduction as barbarians from the sciences away from high culture. But it is, in fact, as it disappears, being revealed to consist of a domain, a very broad domain of little understood and mostly unexplored phenomena. And that brings me then to the borderland disciplines arising from the natural sciences, which is Steve Pinker and my common interest. These borderland disciplines, which are beginning to bridge over, particularly to the social sciences at long last, are four in number. I believe they can be counted that way. First of all, cognitive neuroscience, also known as the brain sciences, which is imaging with rapidly improving resolution in time and space, the activities of the brain. And these activities are more and more complex, so the searching ability of these techniques is improving swiftly. A second borderland discipline is behavioral genetics, human behavioral genetics, which through combinations of very sophisticated analysis of the genetic relationships correlated with cognitive and other characteristics of mental activity in human beings, and the rapid advance of human genetics overall to the molecular level, to the level of the gene and the genetic code, is beginning to provide a solid foundation on which to build a biological understanding of the programming of the anatomy of the brain and ultimately of its algorithms and thus biological activities. A third borderland discipline is evolutionary biology, the attempts to trace the history of the human species, and now especially the origins of the mind in terms of the survival and reproductive value it gives, the Darwinian fitness. This was a subject that I got into 20 years ago with sociobiology in the early stages of this investigation. Sociobiology is now also known as evolutionary psychology and has lost a lot of its sting. It's now seen much more as a reasonable discipline in its own right, well cultivated now by a new generation of very bright scholars. And finally, environmental sciences are as the borderland discipline that describes with increasing definitive detail the arena in which the human species as a biological species evolved and to which we are exquisitely well adapted. So environmentalism is a way of thinking, and as well as a discipline that benefits from the naturalistic approach, the materialist approach, foretold by the extension of the natural sciences into that borderland area. And not to neglect the contributions of the social sciences, similar haustoria, the development, extensions are occurring from the social sciences through fields like cognitive psychology and biological anthropology, and they are beginning to meet and interconnect consiliently with the natural sciences. The key to understanding what is happening and why it is important is, in my judgment, that this approach is allowing us at long last to provide a precise and operational definition of human nature, and I will offer it now. Human nature is not the genes that prescribe human nature. Human nature is not the cultural universals like the incest taboo and the rites of passage found all through the human species, which are the products of human nature. Human nature is the epigenetic rules, the hereditary regularities in development, and particularly mental development, that lead to the consistencies of the natural sciences and the social sciences plus the humanities. Now, the natural sciences are pretty fully consilient all the way from quantum physics through reagent chemistry to macromolecular biology to cell biology, organismic biology, and on up to, as we will address tonight jointly, the brain itself, the working of the brain and mind. With the prospect, and this is what makes consilience still speculative, yet promising and exciting to an increasing number of scholars on both sides of that line, the prospects of consilience extending on at last to the social sciences and the humanities. That, of course, was the dream, one of the dreams of the Enlightenment thinkers of the 17th and the 18th centuries, that all of human knowledge could be unified and that this unification would serve to the progress of the human species. It failed to deliver on its promise from the natural sciences, however, and that was just one of the reasons why the original Enlightenment died toward the end of the 18th century. Now the renewal, and this would be my main argument, a part of my main historical part of my argument, the time has arrived at last to consider the renewal of the Enlightenment and a unification agenda. The central part of the argument then devolves to that line which for centuries has been drawn between the two cultures, roughly defined as the two cultures. The natural sciences on one side, the social sciences, particularly the humanistic aspects of the social sciences, and the humanities on the other side. We are now, I think, discovering by efforts coming from both sides of that line that it is not an epistemological discontinuity with different truths and ways of thinking fundamentally different on both sides. It is not that line, a Hadrian wall, built to keep the